Hello and welcome to the Aviatrix Book Review. I'm Liz Booker. My guest today is a combat veteran British Royal Air Force Tornado GR4 fighter pilot, a motivational speaker, and an entrepreneur. She has parlayed her experience from the front line into business consulting, bringing the principles of combat aviation and military culture to the corporate world. Her action-filled and often humorous memoir, An Officer, Not a Gentleman, the inspirational journey of a pioneering female fighter pilot, is the Aviatrix Book Club discussion book for December 2022. You can find her at her website, mandyhickson.com, on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn at Mandy Hickson, and on Instagram at Mandy Hickson Speaker. Mandy Hickson, welcome.
Thank you, Liz. Lovely to be able to join you finally.
I know, I'm so excited. I know I sent you a note like last November and you said, wow, you're a planner. And then the year just zipped by, didn't it?
It always does, doesn't it? But it was quite funny. I remember it thinking, gosh, that's a year ago.
I know. Well, I'm so excited about this book. I think it's a fabulous way to end the year, and I'll talk more about that. But first, can you give us an overview for anyone who might not have had a chance to read it?
Sure. So it's An Officer, Not a Gentleman, very aptly titled for myself. It's basically an autobiography of my life from joining the Air Force when women were only just allowed to become pilots in the Air Force, in the Royal Air Force in the UK. And I was the second woman to fly a Tornado GR4. So it really takes you on a lovely little canter throughout my life, throughout trying to get into the Air Force, the problems that I struggled with in that front, then a lot through the officer training, the selection process, and all of the different training squadrons that I went through as well. So everything from, we start off flying the Tutor, the Tucano, the Hawk, and then finally I ended up flying the Tornado GR4. Lots of my time spent, therefore, in the Air Force on flying squadrons, conduct after capture courses, all of those sorts of exciting things. Lots of humour, roller coaster of emotions, and culminating with me leaving the Air Force and then moving into my second career, which is now keynote speaking.
Well, and you left out a little bit of some combat time as well in there.
Oh, yes, there was a bit. That was just sort of, and that was in my Tornado time. Yeah,
yeah, very important. And you were only the second woman to fly the Tornado. Is that right?
I was, yeah, the second woman to fly the Tornado GR4 in combat. So yes, we had a lovely girl, Jo Salter, who's a great friend of mine. She was the first, and I followed in hot pursuit.
Well, man, thank you so much for being a pioneer in that way. And I have to tell you, so first of all, yes, the humor in your book is fabulous. It is such a breath of fresh air, to be honest with you. In October, the book club discussed two books, one of which was about the first 6 naval women in the United States to go through flight training. And then another was a memoir of a woman who went through a little bit after them. And I think the whole book club is just, it was pretty heavy, to be honest with you. And I think we were all a bit exhausted. I mean, I think there are common themes in all of our books of, just women trying to navigate a career in a man's field, or it has been up until now. Those have happened in every book, but I think for some reason that month, I know it hit me really hard and very close to home because I'm also a naval aviator, even though I was in the Coast Guard. But, even our airline pilots were like, geez, I need a break. And so to have a book like yours where, yes, those themes exist in your book also, but you take a kind of a lighter approach to them, and you always, wrap it in a sense of humor. It was so entertaining, so well put together. So I'm really, really grateful to end the year with this book on sort of a high note. Very inspiring.
Thank you. That's lovely to hear, because I think actually the humour is something that I've used obviously the whole of my life just to get through it as well. So actually to be able to get that across in your book without it just being a bit thigh slapping sort of feel to it, which I didn't want it to be, but I want it to really represent my voice, which I think it does.
Yes. So I both read and listened to the book.
Oh my
And I really,
goodness, you're a
I
glutton for
just,
punishment.
well, not at all. I actually preferred listening because that's another thing. It's so refreshing to have a contemporary woman's voice from another country and just, and like hear the, the colloquialisms and sort of the phrases that you use to describe things, which translate, of course, to our training and our experiences, but they're presented in such a fresh way. So anyway, I'm going to stop gushing out the book so you can talk because I could sit here and praise it all day long. First of all, why did you write this? Who was your target audience and what do you hope it achieves?
Okay, so it was mixed. I didn't want to write a book. There you go. I've said it. So when I left the Air Force, I left the Air Force in 2011, so 11 years ago, and I had no intention of writing a book. When I was in the Air Force, it was the whole point was about just getting on with your job. It was not shining. It was not being somebody different. And I hadn't really grasped, I think, that when I left, the further away I got from it, the more reflective that you become on it, and the more you realize that you actually have a duty and a responsibility. And I've used this phrase before, is to make sure that the ladder that we climbed up is firmly rooted on the ground for people to follow. And actually you realize more and more of just how much you are becoming a role model. And although I didn't ever feel like a pioneer when I was in the Air Force, actually, when I started doing my speaking and speaking to corporate audiences, but also to a lot of children at schools, you realize that, they all ask the same question. Every single question was, have you written a book? And I'd always say, no, I can't write. That's not my skill set. English was not one of the subjects I would stem through and through. Give me maths, give me my sciences. But English, there was no answer, and I hated it. So, actually, I was not warming to English, and I was therefore not warming towards writing a book. And it was only really on reflection when I was speaking to a great friend of mine from university days who was a journalist, and the two of us decided to work in collaboration together on writing the book. So that worked brilliantly. And again, it's about not hiding that fact. Use your skill sets, use your friends, your colleagues around you. And he could put the icing on the cake to my story, which was fantastic. And it was wonderful to work with such a great friend as well. And he knew me, he knew my humor, he knew exactly how I worked. So the two of us working together was a really good combination. And so really when we started talking, we decided to put the book together, and then we sent it out to publishers. We didn't get any take up, which was frustrating to say the least.
I should say so, and I'm shocked to hear that.
Yeah, to be honest, we got a literary agent really quickly. So someone snapped us up from a very, very high, high caliber literary agents in London, right in the centre. And they work with a lot of big names. They sent it out to lots of people. They had no take-up at all. And I was really disappointed. I was also really surprised because I was already building up quite a big social media presence by then through my speaking. I was getting quite a good name in the speaking world. And actually, I thought, I've got a ready-made audience. It's going to sell. It's the only book that's been written by a female pilot in the Air Force at that point about her story. Jo had written a different one, which was more a leadership book. But there wasn't something like this. So it was unique. How many books and how many stories are there out there that are unique? And this was. So I was genuinely quite surprised that it wasn't picked up. But my best rejection email that I got was from a major publishing house that said, plain books, which annoyed me to start with. Plain books are for a male readership that have no interest in a woman's story. Unquote. And that I was furious when I got that. I thought, it's not a plain book. We call it, an aircraft, or we'd call it something different, but not a plain book. And I thought, for a male readership, well, it turned out that I would say about 70-80% of my readers are men who absolutely love
believe that. Of course.
It's ridiculous.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely ridiculous. So we would have talked about this later, but we're on this topic now. How did you end up publishing?
So after receiving all these rejection emails, I thought, well, actually, do you know what? Let's look at Amazon. And I'd heard that you could self-publish on Amazon. So I looked into the KDP, the Kindle Direct Publishing, and it was pretty simple. It actually was really quite self-explanatory. It was a process that you could follow. I contacted, I found a really good person to format the book for me, to actually put it into a really good structure. And, he came out with a cover. So it didn't feel like it was sort of me putting together my science project from school feeling to it. So it felt like it was very professionally produced. I'll be honest though, the first one that went out, someone did contact me with 40 errors. And that was after I'd had it proofread. So there were mistakes that were made, I'm a hand on heart, that's fine. And in fact, I did find 5 mistakes in that is still there in the ebook, but they're not in the copy print. But it was. I went through the Amazon printing process. It was so simple, print on demand. You can literally just click the button for the countries you want to get it out to, and it was really easy. And I thought, well, actually, why not? And I contacted a couple of my friends, a guy called John Nichols, who has written lots of books, Spitfire, Lancaster. He was a prisoner of war in the Gulf War One. And he actually said, Mandy, I think there's some merits to be said for you going down the self-publishing route, when we talked about it. And actually it's turned into, I'll be brutally honest, very lucrative. I've probably made a lot more money than I would have done, had I done it through a publisher.
Absolutely.
The percentages you're taking are completely different. I don't want to get into the money side, but I was really surprised by how little you get when you do it publishing.
No, we've talked about that lots on this podcast and videos and stuff. I recently did an interview for the writers with a hybrid publisher, and I was interviewing her on behalf of our memoirists because we have so many. And also, like, going back to what you were talking about earlier, so many who are asked the very same question that you are. Do you have a book? When are you going to write a book? And they're like, that's not my jam. And so I'm here, like, trying to provide them resources to, if they don't want to write it, they don't have to write it themselves. There are people who will help you do that. And so it's so lovely to hear that you figured out a way to do it in such a high quality way. It's so well told and so well organized. And this idea of self-publishing was one that I was not considering for myself, because I'm writing for young adults, and I've been told my whole writing journey that in order to get books in the hands of young people, it has to go through a traditional publisher. But I'm learning that may not necessarily be exclusively the case. And so it's so great to hear a success story like yours.
And I think it's very interesting as well, because you spoke there specifically about who you write to, young adults. So this was the big problem that all the publishing houses had when they said, and who is the genre? Who is it appealing to? And I said, well, I'll be honest. I speak to children, and I speak to 90-year-olds, and I speak to high-level corporate, and everybody in between, and everybody loves the story. So actually, there was no reason that a 13-year-old could not pick up this book and love it, as well as an 80-year-old veteran, as well as a corporate lawyer who might still pick up quite a few key learning points from the leadership lessons.
Then their heads explode, because then they don't know how to place it.
But they said that, they went, well, we don't know how to place that, so that doesn't really work. And I said, okay, the genre therefore is adult. But it doesn't work. So, and they didn't like that. They didn't know where to place it.
Drives me crazy. Well, man, I'm so glad you did it. I'm so glad you went the route that you did. And I'm so happy for you if you are actually getting an income, because that doesn't always happen for writers. Good for you.
One thing I absolutely love as well is that because I have all the copyright for it as well, I can contact my lovely local printer, a gentleman who runs a tiny print shop here in Winchester, this lovely little city I live in. And I go, Tony, can you print me off 1,000 copies? And he said, I certainly can, Mandy. When would you like them by? And then he'll drop them round to my house. I love this. And it's this really lovely. And he said, I don't want to print them in the black and white like Amazon do. I'm going to put colour pictures in it. It's a much better quality. And so he just said, well, you know what? I'm going to print them as I would want this printed. And he can't believe it. He said he's never had a book that he's printed so many copies of.
That is fabulous. What a glorious story. Oh my gosh. And I'm going to have to get a copy of that version with the color. Well, let's talk about your flying. And, you know, some people listen to this who have read the book. And then I know that I have a bunch of people who listen who don't read all the books, but maybe by hearing some of your stories, they'll be inspired to read it. So how did you get into flying?
So through the Air Cadets, basically. Air Cadets for us in the UK, 13 to 18-year-olds run sort of, you know, basically to get anyone interested into aviation, but also into the forces generally. And it's a really good organisation for building the confidence of young people, especially if they're struggling at school or they don't fit in that domain. Sometimes they can really find their feet. I joined the Air Cadets and I flew. And it was lovely because I'd grown up hearing stories of my grandpa, who was a pilot during the Second World War. And so really on the first night that the Air Cadets opened its doors to girls, I joined. And when I flew, I can remember this first flight more clearly than probably any moment in my life. And I remember because he said we have to call him sir at the end of every statement. And he said, "Oh, look at those beautiful flowers." And I went, lovely, sir. Yes, sir. And I was, even if I said, I put a sir on the end. And I just remember I said, "Do you get paid to do this?" And he said, "Well, I've been paid all my life to be a pilot." And I was like, oh my gosh, if you can get paid to do what you love, you're never going to have to work. And it was that point where I thought, right, that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, and that was so inspiring. We have a similar program called the Civil Air Patrol here, where you get to wear a uniform and learn what it is to be in sort of in the military environment, but also can take some familiarization flights and start learning how to fly. So, and then tell us the story about how you decided to go to the Air Force, and then you were told no. Many times.
A few times. Yes.
Starting at the very beginning. Tell us about that and kind of like how you powered through those moments of being told no.
It's interesting again because, you know, people say, "Oh, you're so determined, you're so resilient." And at the time, you're not doing it, are you? You're just going, "Oh, I want to get in. I want to do this." And so you become more and more resilient as the more and more you stick it out. But when I first applied, it was for a flying scholarship initially. And I was told by a doctor that I was obese. And when he said I was obese, I was 6 foot tall. I was playing county sport, netball. I was playing tennis, hockey, all sports under the sun. I was so fit and healthy. It was unbelievable. And he said to me, "How are you going to remedy your obesity problem?" And I was 12 and a half stone at the time, which, gosh, what's that in pounds? I can't think, but we could work it out by times it by 14. I'm not going to do that maths in public. I think 168 or something like that. Anyway, I was this, and I was 6 foot tall. They said, "You're obese." And I said, "What? Sorry." He goes, "You should be 9 3/4 stone." And I was like, I'd have to chop a leg off, quite frankly, to lose 3 stone in weight. So what's that going to be? 28, 38, 42 pounds he wanted me to lose. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm never going to do it. And I basically went on the world's biggest diet and I lost all the weight. And I went to my doctor to get the stamp. And she just said, "Oh my goodness, Mandy, you actually look anorexic. This is ridiculous." And basically it was down to the fact that the height charts only went up to 5'9" for women. And so he basically added a couple of pounds on and assumed that this amount of me would obviously, I'm hoping that maybe it was my ankle, that bit that might be that much, but it's ridiculous, isn't it? So that was my first hurdle. The second hurdle was that women weren't allowed to be pilots. And I then was awarded a flying scholarship. I went off to university. I joined the next club, which is the University Air Squadron. So it's again run by the RAF. Gained about 160 hours of flying, which I loved. I love this organisation more than anything. It's the biggest and the best-selling, tool that the Air Force have for undergraduates, I believe. And while I was there, they changed the rules, and I applied to join, and I failed all of the computer-based aptitude tests. I failed them not once but twice, and so I shouldn't have been allowed to join, basically.
You described those tests, and I really could. That was probably the one thing that I couldn't picture. Like, what on earth were they testing? I mean, it sounded like a video game.
Yeah, so basically, can you remember Sonic the Hedgehog?
Right, yeah.
He used to go through these like tubes, and he'd have to collect these gold hoops, and you'd have to basically make sure that your hand-to-eye coordination went round at exactly the right pace for Sonic to catch all the hoops as he's going around this little tube. So there'll be one like that sort of equivalent whereby a dot is going up the screen and you've just got to move your hand at the right speed, and then the dot would speed up and slow down as it's going up on this wiggly line. There was a one with a box like this. I mean, this is a long time ago, Liz.
I know, but video games were out then too, so.
Yeah, but this box had a square around it, and there was this ball within the box, and the ball kept on trying to escape, and you had to keep the dot in the middle of the box. And so you had to very quickly work out left, move the ball left, and then you were working it out. Every time it shot up, you'd push it down. So it felt very intuitive. Then halfway through, once you're nailing it, they suddenly change the direction, so everything is 180 out. And now if you push it down, it shoots off the bottom. You're thinking, oh no, I've got to pull it up. So it's how quickly can you convert something that is a learned pattern or learned behavior very quickly. How can you do the opposite, and how quickly is it going to take you to adapt? So there were about 4 hours worth of different testing, from mental agility, situational awareness, navigation puzzles, maths problems. I mean, maths I was absolutely fine on, but all of those sorts of things. Yeah. And I failed them twice.
Yeah, that's crazy. You know, I can hover a helicopter pretty well, but I can't play a video game either. So, you know,
my children say to me, oh, Mum, do you want to have a go on this flight simulator? I think, no, because I was from appalling, and that I was a fast jet pilot, and now they're going to go, oh my God, you're rubbish, and I shot you down immediately.
It's the same. It's the same here. That's so funny. Well, then how did that resolved itself? Because you won this aerobatic competition, like people knew you could fly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd really proved myself. I was probably the one of the top couple of pilots within my cadre that joined. And it was the boss of the university club, actually, the University Air Squadron, who just said, hold on a minute, this doesn't make sense. Why, when you can obviously fly? And he got external examiners, they all flew with me, they all graded me at the highest mark. And so we now have a computer program saying that she can't, and then humans were saying, well, she can. And that's when the Air Force offered me a commission initially to become an air traffic controller, which I took and I genuinely took it because I do believe that when you serve up to serve in the military, you are serving to serve in the military primarily. And then the job that you do has got to come second to that. And I so love the whole camaraderie, the teamwork. I love the leadership aspects of it. And I really wanted to be part of the Air Force. And so I desperately wanted to be a pilot, but I did believe I would be able to change their minds. So once I was working with the old boss, writing many letters, we finally got a letter back which basically said they were taking me on as a test case. And actually, it's only really since I've left as well. I do a lot of speaking, and I was speaking at an event. Actually, it was with a lovely friend, Susie Morgan, who's part of your book club.
We love Susie.
We love Susie as well. And she's a fellow ambassador with me for the Department of Transport. And we were at this event, and I was telling this story, and one of a fellow pilot who's a commercial pilot came up and said, I was one of the people that failed the tests. And I was told that they were taking on a test case, which is now I've discovered is you, and that they weren't taking any more on because they could not understand why all these women were failing the tests, but they did not want to take a whole influx of women who'd failed the tests in case they didn't do very well.
Well, that is very frustrating for those women who didn't get the chance.
Really frustrating.
And a huge relief that you were able to be successful also, so that you could kind of break that barrier for them. My gosh. So this is one of the things that I loved about your book, was the ways in which you were open and honest about your failures. And then also how you talked about how those failures kind of followed you when you ran into stumbling blocks later, because I think that's a very common thing, but we're pilots, we don't talk about that stuff. I'm put together, I've got all my shit together, right? So but that I think you described it as like the devil imposter on your shoulder, and then your angel, your guardian angel, who knows that you're competent and capable. So I loved that.
Yeah, and I think, do you know what though? Because you just brought on a really interesting point there, Liz, because you just said that pilots don't talk about it. But actually, if you think what we do, we debrief, don't we? So actually, when we fly a mission, we come back and we talk about it. So really what we're talking about there are our failings, because often it's the bits We're not going, oh, that was brilliant. You were great. You're often going, why were you doing that? That wasn't great. And so it's mostly you're talking about the ways that you can improve. And so actually, although it can be really hard to hear that when you're first starting out, you get more and more used to that technique of that debrief, the honest, the constructive feedback, and therefore building that into talking openly about failure as being that's fine. Because ultimately, do you know what? I think it's fascinating because in the modern world we're in at the moment, everyone talks about resilience as being one of the biggest things that we need to have. We need to have resilience. Our children need to have it. We need, everyone needs this word resilience. How do you get resilient? Well, you're not gifted it, are you? You get resilient by failing at things. But we don't want to talk about the failure. So how do you become this thing that everybody wants to be when you're not talking about this thing? And if you think even going back to say how we were at school, you're taking us, is it the spelling bee? Have I got the right American colloquialism there? But you're doing your spelling tests and you come home and your parents will say, how did you do? And you say, I got 10 out of 10. Brilliant. You're a successful young lady. And your sister got 3 out of 10. Oh dear. You didn't do well. You failed in that way. And it's interesting because ultimately I have 2 boys. One is severely dyslexic who always got 3 out of 10 and the other and did so much work. And didn't do well. And I had one boy that literally looked at the list before he went in and got full marks. And what do we reward? The one that gets 10 out of 10. And so actually very quickly you realise you have to reward effort. And therefore, if they fail, that's fine because they will find their way. And guess who's most resilient of my children? The severely dyslexic one, because he's had to become so resilient because he feels in many ways that he's failed at so many stages of his life.
Yeah. I think so. So to just go back to the point that I was making about how open you were and articulate that you were about your failings and how they built upon each other and how you overcame them and your own self-talk, thinking and it sounds like in your culture too, it was evolving while you were in it to a more confessional sort of culture, as was mine. And there were people who did it well, who had humility and humor and were able to make fun of themselves. And then there were people who were not very good leaders, frankly, who hid their failings and tried to look like they were put together. And that it made them unrelatable. So like thinking about the way in which you're translating this to corporate world and those messages that you're trying to get across from our lessons, it made them unrelatable, unrealistic, and kind of revealed some deep-seated insecurities that they were harboring. So to have you like be completely open about them just shows a lot of confidence in yourself.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I did always used to be really confident when I was young. I'll be honest. I went through and I sort of was, I do think I probably got in very inherent leadership. I'd always be the one that would sort of end up stepping forward. I couldn't help myself. Even at my tennis club, I'd be like, yes, I will be the chairman because I can't stand to see things organised badly. I can't help it, but you just want to step up and do that sort of thing. So I do think there is some inherent leadership there. And I think actually when I was told I was going to fail, that I was being this test case, that did plant the seeds of doubt. And it literally, when I look back, I never put a name on it at the time. My goodness, this was the 1990s. We were just like, I don't know, rabbit in the spotlight. I'm going through training. But actually it was basically saying, you're an imposter, you're waiting to fail, and it's interesting. I've spoken to quite a few other female aviatrixes as well, and who went through the military training system, and many of them felt exactly the same way. This was a testosterone-filled, very misogynistic, very alpha male environment when we joined. Now, I do believe it's changed because, as you said, you saw it changing in your time, and I very much saw it changing in mine. Even within sort of a year on the squadron, it changed from this, very alpha to actually people having more honest conversations, showing, their weaknesses, showing their vulnerabilities. And I think that's so important because when you look at any good leaders, that's exactly what they do. They're transparent and they show their vulnerability.
Yep. It doesn't matter if you're in the military or in the business world. I agree. And just showing, you don't have to be a train wreck every day, but like just showing that you are vulnerable every once in a while,
Yeah,
like will really
absolutely.
help people connect with you for
Yeah,
sure.
I love that.
Well, this is a narrative that I've been thinking about a lot, about like what leaders I connected with and what kind of leader I tried to be, which was to, some days. So unlike you, where you had your children at the end of your career, I went to flight school with the child, and then I had two children while I was in flying jobs. And so like there were days when I was literally shaking a screaming child off my leg, at daycare so that I could get in time for the brief. And then I had to like have all my shit together. So, but I'm not the only one who goes through that. People who were working for me were going through that too. And so to pretend that that stuff isn't going on, is just completely, it makes you, whatever you're doing, unattainable for people behind you when they can't see that you have real life problems too. So I'm all about the vulnerability. So you know what? You flew this fast jet. I think you are the first woman I have interviewed who flew a jet like this. And I just want you to know, when I was a teenager, I was so charged up. I mean, I was 13 when Top Gun came out. Yeah, we're like
the same age, aren't we?
I think so. And I finished flight school, by the way, in 99. So
yeah.
yeah.
So have you got a big birthday next year?
I did the next month. This month for this recording. Yes.
Ooh, happy birthday coming up.
Thank you. Half a century. Yo. 50 is the new 30. Anyway.
It really is. We're going to keep on telling everyone that anyway.
Exactly right. So, the jets. Oh my gosh. Like I still feel like this adrenaline rush when I hear jet noise. So inspired by it. And you got to fly these things and have that. One of the other things I loved is your descriptions of flying and like the feeling of flying, the feeling of that G suit cinching down on you, the feeling of G's. Tell us about flying the Tornado.
I think it looks like what it was designed to do. And I love that about it. So it looks like a bomber. It's not necessarily the most beautiful. I think it's a fantastic looking aircraft. I really do. I genuinely love it. And I think, it's huge in size. I was amazed when I first walked up to it and I was like, oh my God, it's big, it's intense. And it's unbelievable. I mean, when I first sat in it, and I'll never forget this moment of just taxiing it. And you've been in the simulator, you've done all your simulator training. So you know the cockpit, you're used to the cockpit environment. And then when you're sitting in the front, I've got my an instructor in the back seat. It's a twin stick aircraft. And he just said, Mandy, it's all yours. You take off. And I was like, oh my God, click the burner in, click the second one in, and then full reheat and literally acceleration. You feel yourself getting thrust back in your seat, literally, as you accelerate. I couldn't take the smile off my face. I really couldn't. And I think I finished one of the chapters by saying I wasn't sure if this was just a fast jet thing or whether it was permanently stuck there with G-force from that moment onwards. But it really is an incredible feeling, and it's not one that I just feel so honored to have had that opportunity to do that and to experience that.
One of the things that I was curious about was when you were like, not curious about it because you describe it so well, but like when you're in sort of these combat situations where you're doing this dog fighting, like how did you keep your wits about you and like your situational awareness in those fast moving environments? And then also like, did you experience this? Because I feel like I experienced this, like our intense moments in a helicopter, in a seagoing service, were landing on the backs of ships. The ship is moving around, you're moving around, it's at night. And there's this weird zone you get into where it's like you're not even really thinking about what you're doing anymore. It's almost like a feel, and you just... your training and experience takes over, and you just, sometimes I got on the deck and I was like, that just magically happened. I don't know how I did that. You know what I mean?
I mean, you've landed on a moving piece of concrete, basically. It's phenomenal, isn't it? I mean, my husband was a helicopter pilot in the Navy as well, and he said some of the most worrying or scary flights he's ever had were landing a helicopter back on a ship at night. And it's the concentration and as you say, the situational awareness is the one thing that you can't get across to people, I think, until they've done that. Because people think, well, what is situational awareness? And I sort of describe it as being, having the ability to sort of think ahead, look at the bigger picture constantly. And actually, it's something that you will see people either have it or they don't. Having driven now with 4 of my children, 2 of them have great situational awareness and 2 of them don't. And it's interesting that it's not always the ones that are the most academic, or it doesn't matter. It's not connected to that side of things. It's definitely a seeing the bigger picture thing as well. And I think when when I was doing air-to-air combat, that was primarily on the Hawk aircraft, which was a training aircraft, doing the dogfighting. And I enjoyed it, but I didn't enjoy it as much as I loved my low flying. I loved the low flying environment. I loved the precision. I loved timings. I think that's my sort of my mathematical side of my brain was I love trying to hit a time on target. Even now when I'm doing a speech and someone says, you've got to speak for 60 minutes, I will be looking at the timer and I will slow my voice down. I will do it so I hit the exact moment. And then I'll finish and go, by the way, I was exactly on time. So it was like, well done me. But it's that brain that you just go, I want targets, literal and metaphorical targets. So yeah, it's quite funny.
That's awesome. So, but was it that way for you when you were like tracking things, got like in this combat situation that you describe at the beginning of the book and we go back to later in the book? Like, is that how it was for you? Did you kind of get into this zone where you're just doing things?
Yeah, you're working really hard. Your brain is working at, double speed to normal. It really is. It got easier with more experience. I remember those very first few flights. It felt overwhelming, all of the things that you were trying to remember to learn. And constantly we have this thing called a radar homing and warning receiver, constantly getting spikes. It's basically a screen down on your right-hand side, and you get a little basically a banner coming up as to what missile system on the ground is looking at you. And then you have to try and edge your way around it. We sort of call it 50 pence piecing around the outside of it so that you're not going into that zone. And, all of those things together with trying to hit your targets, together with keeping an awareness, because we weren't in close formation with our wingmen up there. We were often like a mile apart. So trying to keep a picture of where are they in the sky? What's my impact on where I'm turning going to have an impact on them? If I cut a corner, will we get too early? We've got the Americans that are coming in. They're on suppression of enemy air defences. We're working well with them. They've got a time on target. So all of these things are going on. So I wouldn't say it became natural, but I did get more and more capacity as my experience started to get better and better, or more and more experience, should I say. But you are working really, really hard. And I was never the best pilot, by the way, and I always put my hand up and say that. I was never the best pilot on my squadron by any stretch. I was an all right pilot, and I got through, and I was a good wingman. Was I the best? No, I wasn't, but that's fine.
I always tell people I was a very average pilot in a very above average standardization world. I was very average, but like average in that group of pilots is pretty good.
But you know what was interesting as well, actually, Liz? It was when I was looking back recently through a whole load of my officer reports. And as I was looking through them, this was actually after writing the book, and I happened to find them in the loft. And it was all these sort of comments, not one comment from any boss or any of my seniors, who are all men, no other women. Not one of them said Mandy's doing pretty well for the fact she's actually the only woman on the squadron. There was no space for that whatsoever. It was Mandy's doing this as a first tourist. She's under, scoring on this level. She needs to make a bit more of an effort. She needs to spend more time being sociable with all the guys of an evening. You're like, maybe I need a bit of my own space. It's all these comments, but not one reflected on actually. There was no female toilets. There was no space to be a woman in that world. So actually not one of them reflected on actually how difficult that might have been.
Well, that's so interesting that you say that, because that would have been illegal in you were not supposed to make gendered comments in our evaluations. But to your point, and I don't think I've ever thought about this before, because that's there, you don't have the opportunity to articulate like what a challenge it is to be in the minority for all of those reasons. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and you're right as well. They wouldn't actually. Having said that, one of my race reports did say Amanda is an Amazonian 6 foot tall athletic woman. That's how it started. I was like, Amazonian. Yeah, is that positive? I'm thinking I'm taking it as positive.
Yeah, I mean, like, is that relevant to your performance? Like, what does it even mean? and were they commenting on the men's physique?
I don't think so. Surprisingly, no. He's a 5'1", very small man with a small man attitude. No, they don't. I don't think they say that.
Oh, so now we're on this topic. You received criticism at some point in your career, these wacky rules that you guys had, and you were told that you were not being ladylike enough, which was just like absurd. And you obviously like were incensed by it, but also took it with a sense of humor at some point. But where are you on the subject of being ladylike these days?
I'm incredibly ladylike. No, I'm more ladylike than I was, I think. Do you know what? I'm me. I am me. And I just think I'm sick of trying to be somebody I'm not. You either like me or you don't like me. And it's just like, you know what? Do we have to be ladylike? I wear my dresses. I take the corporate part. And I enjoy it. And I just think, you know what? I don't think it's about being ladylike anymore. I just think it's about being true to ourselves. But you're right. My God, it annoyed me when I was going through training, and it was the smallest point, wasn't it? And it's the bit that everyone quotes to me is the fact that you had to order 2 half pints of beer. Infuriated me. Because a pint is not ladylike.
So absurd. So absurd.
I'll let you know if it's changed, because I'm going to speak tomorrow to RAF Shawbury, which is our helicopter training. And I'm going flying in a military helicopter tomorrow morning. And then I'm doing a session for them, a speech for all the pilots. And I am being treated to an evening in the officers' mess. So I'll let you know if I manage to have a pint or whether I order 2 halves.
You're so great. Well, at some point, it was obvious that you were not going to be able to, unlike me, where I was in a career where I could continue flying, even while pregnant, which really? I did for one of my pregnancies. I flew for 5.5 months. For the last one, I experienced some, miscarriages too along the way. And so for my last pregnancy, I was an aged mother at 40 years old and elected not to fly, which was the death knell for my career, because I was the chief pilot at the time. And I was the only woman who had ever done that. So it's okay. I went off and did some other lovely things for the Coast Guard. I was a foreign diplomat. It all worked out just fine, but I wasn't able to break back into aviation, which I would have. But for you, flying fast jets, that wasn't going to work. And so you made this very difficult decision to leave the service. Talk about that.
Yeah, I still do reflect back, actually. And I sort of it's going to always be in my mind, the what if question. And it's the one area where I think, gosh, if I'd stayed in, how would I have done? I don't know whether I'm just too Mandy for the Air Force, whether I would have ever progressed, who knows? But it's a question I'll never know the answer to. And it's probably the one thing that I feel my circle, therefore, has not been completed on that respect. And when I look back at that point where there was an absolute critical point in my career when I'd had my 2 children on a ground tour, and I went to my posting officer and I asked him what was my next job potential. And he just said, it's going straight back to the Tornado, Mandy, or it's flying as an instructor at RAF Valley in Anglesey in Wales. And it was this really big decision. And I said, well, I've got a 4-month-old baby that I'm still breastfeeding and a 21-month-old by then. You know, there were 2 very little boys. My husband was a full-time airline pilot. And I thought, how is this going to work? I couldn't really see a way forward. I already had a full-time nanny, but I couldn't then deploy to Afghanistan for 4 months and just leave my nanny, who was, she was there during the day. She came at 6 a.m. when I left, and she left at 6 p.m. when I got home. And it was pretty brutal. But she was absolutely, Mary Poppins as far as we're concerned. She's this wonderful, wonderful lady. And and basically I just thought I'm going to have to look at a different one. And that's when I found this desk job, which was the one that I took. But I was told if I took it, I would never be promoted again. And that was a really hard one. That really was a hard one, because when I look back, the Air Force got that wrong. They got that really wrong. And it's something that I have talked to them about since leaving. And in fact, the guy that did tell me that is in fact the head of the Air Force at the moment. So it's quite interesting to actually have that direct dialogue with someone that is actually at the top level in the Air Force. And actually, when I look back, they did make a mistake. Without a doubt, they made a big mistake. And it's a shame. It really is. Because I think, not one person said to me, Mandy, would you like to stay? When and I think, gosh, not only are you just giving up with a normal pilot, but actually with one of those very first ones that actually, if you'd offered me a better job or something that I could have done, it was at the stage when my boys were 5 and 6. And actually I could have perhaps found something that would have worked with me. But this whole ridiculous thing of you've not done the right job, so you're not going to get promoted. You therefore can't stay. It was archaic.
Yeah. And I was that guy. We call them detailers. And so, I called the game. I didn't make the rules. And I would have told you in that context, I would have told you the same thing. Your career is going to be over. Yeah, because that's the way the rules are and were. And so I'm glad to hear you say that you're having conversations with them, because I wasn't going to ask you this, but now I want to. Like, do you see space in the Royal Air Force to make some cultural changes to provide, and is there value in that? Like, is the attitude still, well, like if they can't hang with the way that we do things, then we don't need them? Or is there an appetite for change?
But I think there is a real appetite for change, actually. The Air Force has been going through a bit of a hard time at the moment, because they have made a few public announcements which have gone down very badly, which has received quite a lot of media attention, which was basically an email was leaked, which was stating that they were going to put a pause on recruiting white men in the pilot slots so that they could start recruiting women and ethnic minorities, which obviously got out. And you can't do that legally, and B, 85% of the Air Force are white men. And so suddenly actually you're turning your back on all of these guys that have worked incredibly hard to get themselves into a position that they can join the Air Force, and suddenly they're hearing it's being stopped for women. That's going to do no good whatsoever.
So much damage.
Yeah. So much damage, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I can see why they are trying to do something differently, because women have been allowed to fly on the front line now for 30 years, and yet we still have got such a small percentage of women doing it, and ethnic minorities. So they're saying, like, we need to do something different. What can we do? So they are very much open to ideas. They are look at changing. I think the Air Force is a very different place. I've got a great friend of mine, Soraya Marshall, she's the highest ranking female aircrew now in the Air Force. She was in my Las Vegas story. I had to check with her and say, are you okay with me using this? She was like, Mandy, absolutely. I do not want people to be thinking that I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth and I didn't live a little. So I was like, okay. So I sent her the chapter and I cleared it first. But that was an interesting one. But she says, no, we are seeing a much greater percentage of women coming through. We are seeing it culturally very different as well. And I just think the guys that are joining as well are very different people. They're not getting drunk in a bar anymore. They're having their protein shakes. They are, much more healthy minded, much more talking openly about mental health. All of these things are really helping.
Yeah, so interesting. My son is on active duty in the Coast Guard. He's been in for 10 years. He's enlisted on a ship. And he heard our previous commandant came to the ship and said something like, if you're a female, if you're a minority, then we value your participation. We appreciate you. And then, of course, he feels alienated, the white male. Yes. Yeah. And so it's like, I love that they're trying to do this and make us feel welcome, but then you cannot alienate like the majority. So yeah, it's a very delicate balance to figure that out and get it right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting to hear that your services are going through the same things. And I absolutely think that is a huge loss to the Royal Air Force to not have you as I mean, what a great asset you would be for them on so many levels. And so their loss, you've got your own stuff going on now, and good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So are you still flying and instructing?
I'm not actually, to be honest, Liz. It's the first time really in my life that I'm not airborne regularly. The odd flight comes up like tomorrow, but just before COVID hit, so it was the Christmas really before COVID in the March. Actually, I had finally just stopped flying because work was so busy. I was finding I was literally traveling all week, and I'd get to the weekends and I'd be shattered, and I just wanted to go and watch my children play football. I wanted to be mum for the weekend. I didn't want to be going and flying other air cadets and pouring all my energy that I had left into others. And actually, I thought I need to prioritize my family at this point because my work was so busy. And so I finally sort of said, look, I'm just going to take a pause. And they said, well, I said, can you leave my picture on the board though? Because I didn't all the pictures of all the pilots, and I didn't want these young female air cadets to be turning up and never seeing another female face. And actually it does make a difference. And actually I am still up there. And sometimes I get the girls that have read my book contacting me saying, oh, I saw you on the board at Boscombe Down. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've read her book. And it's that joining of the dots. And I think I will go back to it at some point. I'm certainly not excluding it. I just think now is the time when perhaps I need to be doing other things at different levels, and then I'll probably go back to it in a little bit later.
Speaking of the things that you are doing at different levels, oh my gosh, lady, you've had a huge year. You've been everywhere. I see you speaking all over the world, doing amazing things. Tell us about this business that you have. Oh, and then we have to hear about the Tom Cruise picture too. So tell us about this business that you are doing where you're getting, running around public speaking and doing motivational speaking. And yeah, tell us about that.
To be honest, I've been a bit blown away, really. I think I sort of can't believe how much it's taken off, because you sort of think, oh, I'm all right doing it, but people seem to absolutely love it. I think I'm in the right time at the right place, right time, and all of those sorts of things. A lot of companies want a female speaker, that is obvious, and they want someone that will appeal to men and women as well. So they don't want a woman that's going to sort of say, oh, I'm so hard done by, whereas actually I have been lifted up at every single stage of my career by men. If it wasn't for men, I wouldn't be here now, as in my career. And so when I set up my business, I really recognized that, all of the stuff that we do in aviation that is just so obvious to us. And actually referring back to the podcast that you're talking about that Shannon you sent through, there's this lovely moment where Shannon talks about the skill sets that we have from the military, and we sometimes underrate them as to how transferable those skill sets are. And when I left, I assumed I would become a pilot in commercial aviation because that was my skill set. I was a pilot. But actually, all of the transferable skills about the decision-making under pressure, our communication skills, our leadership abilities, all of those human factor elements that we do when we're in training all the time, and they become very inherent and natural to us, they are still lacking in many businesses. And so when I retrained as a human factors consultant, that we call it CRM, Career Resource Management in the UK. I don't know if you refer to it by the same, is it? Yeah. I realized that businesses weren't doing it. And so actually I've set up these workshops initially, and I loved giving them. You can almost translate your workshop you're doing in the aviation world and just take it into business. And they're going, oh, I love it. I love all the games you play in there. I love all of the lessons that come out of it. And then all you need is a few business ones to feed in there. And you suddenly realize, wow, actually this is so transferable. And then actually people just say, actually, can you just do a keynote? You sure? And actually, I managed to really, really hone the keynote sessions that I do now to make them absolutely relatable to. I mean, yesterday was an insurance, it was women in insurance. The day before, it was a technology company. And all you need to do is basically make sure that you're reflecting what their business is in the skills, the key skills that you're pulling out. And it just does really, really well. It does really well. And my husband just goes, make hay while the sun shines. It won't last forever, will it?
I don't know. I think this has legs, but so I just want to make sure that everybody knows that it was Shannon Huffman Paulson, who is the author of The Grit Factor, which is a collection of various women's stories in the military and how they translate to success in the business world. And she did this Veterans Day video where it was really addressing veterans to tell them, like, you know, if you're transitioning and you don't think that you have any transferable skills, it clearly describes how to translate the things that you learned in the military as a leader, as a manager, you know, in the military. I'm sure it's the same in the Royal Air Force as it is for us. It's very intrusive leadership. I mean, you are down in the weeds in people's lives. If they have financial problems, you know about it and you are counseling them and helping them. You know, things that probably don't happen in the civilian world, but as a result, you have all of these sort of just human counseling skills that you kind of grow those skills as you become more senior and have more people working for you. And so that's what she was talking about. And then the things that you're doing, just what you just said about taking those habits and lessons and just tweaking them enough to make them relevant to the audience to whom you're speaking. I think that's wonderful because as I mentioned in our notes together, is I would love to see our collective canon, the stories of women in aviation, reach a broader audience. Now, you've managed to do a little bit of that with your book, and because you have this platform where you're speaking. But I'd like to see all of our stories, and I've been working for the past couple of years on what that narrative is and how to connect with a broader audience. So you're very inspiring in that way as well. What's next for you? So you're doing all this stuff. It's been growing. It's been hugely successful. What are your big dreams? What's success for you?
Well, no, it's a good question, actually. So this year I'm an aviation ambassador with some wonderful, wonderful men and women who I find really inspiring as well. So it's been a great project. We're hoping to carry that on for another year if we can. I know Susie and I are campaigning for that.
Susie Morgan is our book club member. She's a British Airways pilot, and she's been consistently attended every single book club since its inception. So yeah, what do you guys do?
Yeah, so basically you're ambassadors. So you can be called on really, particularly to help out with any STEM events, basically being a face. But what worries us is we want a little bit more to it. And there's been a lot of transition within the government departments. I don't know if you've been hearing about what's been happening in our government, but it's not been
good.
Yes.
It was a relief to have somebody else be center stage.
Oh, absolutely.
In the circus.
Although I do believe you might have a resurgence going on in the US. But let's not talk about that. Anyway, so yeah, we're hoping for a bit more stability because we'd like to get into a bit deeper, really, to say, what can we actually do? We don't just want to be this face that is rolled out for every STEM event and say, oh, here we are talking to the same people who all agree that more needs to be done. What can we actually do? And so we're very much involved in trying to do that. So we're trying to come up with a bit more strategy and things like that to really look at the next generation for aviation to say, you know what, there's going to be a huge deficit, not just of pilots, but for people in aviation as a whole. What can we do to either help funding, to make sure it's not just our privileged few that can afford to get the bank of mum and dad to remortgage their houses to get that funding to get through to being a pilot? What can people actually do? What can the businesses, what can the organisations do to ensure that pipeline is there for the future? Because we are going to be suffering massively with a deficit in pilots, and that's a global one as well. So they brought in these aviation ambassadors to look at that sort of thing and see if we can make any difference. So that's been quite interesting to do that. I have just signed up. I love a challenge. So I did Kilimanjaro 3 years ago, with 20 women. And I absolutely loved it. And I realized I'd missed the camaraderie. I'd missed the challenge, a physical challenge. And so it was my husband's 60th a couple of years ago, and it was my 50th next year. And so his trip to the base camp of Everest was cancelled. And so we have said, well, let's do it in March. So the two of us are going to the base camp of Everest on an expedition, which will be great. So I'm really looking forward to that, because I really do love that whole pushing yourself. And I remember our expedition leader saying, this is grade 3 fun, girls. Grade 3 fun. I mean, grade 1 is having a party. Grade 2 is, this is quite tough, but it's still enjoyable. And grade 3 is no enjoyment whatsoever. But at the end, you will feel the greatest sense of achievement. And I look back on Killian, and 5 days was like that, was grade 2, was brilliant. And then the last day was horrific. But I look back with this amazing sense of pride that I actually achieved this thing when I was so ill. And I think, yeah, you know what? You need to be proud of that, because that was a great achievement. And I think we need things like that to push us forward. The sort of people we are, Liz, you know, you do need those sorts of challenges. So, yeah, there's that one. There's potentially a second book, maybe in the pipeline, you know, but that would be more of a business one. It would be more looking
That's
at all
what I
those.
expected to hear. That's exactly what I expected to hear. Yeah.
So that is in the background, and I'm also buying a camper van. I'm looking at, you know, if I pitch up outside someone's house and I'm in this humongous motorhome, you'll know Mandy's arrived. Yeah,
you're going to do that in the US?
Well, we intend to do it all over. I would love at some point to bring it over if we could or get one in the US and do some serious touring around. That would be great.
I was going to say, so my grandmother was a spar in World War II, which was the Women's Coast Guard Reserve. Then she was in the Foreign Service, and she remarried a British Royal Navy officer, and they retired to Surrey. And when I was around 11 years old, we did a camper tour of, you know, England, Scotland, Wales, State of Lake District. So I've done that over there, and it was lovely.
Brilliant. Oh, well, we're definitely going to be hitting Europe when we get it in the summer. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So, you know what? I'm all for quality of life, balance. And my boys are now 18 and 19. So we've told them that they're at a stage where they can be more independent. I'm not sure whether the house will be standing when we come back after 2 weeks, but let's see.
Good luck with that.
Good luck. She says with a smile on her face.
I have the 19-year-old here, so yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Well, this has just been such a pleasure, Mandy. You are fabulous. I have been looking forward to this all year because I've seen you speak and heard you speak so many times. I know how fun and dynamic you are. The book is lovely. If you're available, join us at the end of December. I think I said December 18th because we had to move it up a week because otherwise it would be on Christmas. So if you're free, join us. That would be so lovely. And until then, good luck with your travels and all your events. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Liz. Honestly, it's such a pleasure to chat to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. I'd like to thank Shasta Ways and Michael Wilds of the Women's SOAR Group for their assistance in producing this interview. The Women's SOAR Group is a media company that gives women a platform to express themselves. That's a wrap for 2022, the Aviatrix Book Club's second year. We have a great lineup of books for 2023, so I look forward to seeing you in the discussions next year, starting with the book Jet Boss by Laura Savino in January. In the meantime, don't forget to check the show notes for a link to sign up for Literary Aviatrix monthly newsletter. Wishing you all warm and happy holidays and the happiest of New Year's, blue skies, and happy reading.